Nathan Carter ran back into a collapsing building. Not because it was his job, because he heard a man screaming his son's name. That single decision shattered 3 of his ribs, crushed his left shoulder, and knocked him unconscious for 11 minutes beneath 6 tons of steel and concrete. But none of that is the most shocking thing that happened to him that day. The most shocking thing happened when he opened his eyes inside the trauma bay and heard a voice he hadn't heard in 22 years lean close to his ear and whisper, "Nathan, do you remember me?" Drop a comment with your city, and let's see how far this story travels. Follow the channel so you never miss what happens next. The morning started the way most Tuesdays started for Nathan Carter. His alarm went off at 5:15. He silenced it before the second buzz, made coffee black, no sugar, the same way he'd been drinking it since his late 20s, pulled on a gray thermal and his worn work boots, the left ones still held together at the toe, with a strip of electrical tape he kept meaning to replace. He grabbed his hard hat off the hook by the door and drove through a Seattle drizzle, so light it barely counted as rain. He had a meeting at 7, site walkthrough at 8, a subcontractor dispute to resolve before noon. Nathan Carter was 40 years old, and his life ran like a well-engineered structure, every load distributed, every joint accounted for, every potential failure point identified and reinforced long before it became a problem. That was his gift. He saw what could go wrong before it did. Except this morning. The Meridian Tower project was 8 months into a 14-month build cycle, and Nathan had spent the last 3 weeks uneasy about a specific section of the Eastern Load-Bearing Framework. He'd flagged it, filed the report, been overruled by a project director who had a completion bonus tied to the schedule and wasn't interested in delays. Nathan arrived on site at 7:42. The morning crew was already working 2 floors up. He was standing at the base of the structure, reviewing revised blueprints, when he felt it that low, almost imperceptible vibration beneath his boots that every experienced structural engineer eventually learns to recognize. Not equipment, not a truck on the street. The building itself was speaking. "Hey!" He grabbed the nearest foreman by the arm. "Get your people down, right now." The foreman looked at him. "We're behind schedule. Nathan, if we—" Now, Nathan's voice didn't rise. It just went flat in a way that made the foreman take a step back, pull them down, and pull them back 50 feet. Do it quietly, so nobody panics, but do it right now. He was already pulling out his radio. He was already doing the math in his head. He got the evacuation moving. 27 workers off the structure in under 4 minutes. He'd positioned himself at the perimeter, counting heads, checking them off against the morning roster, when the foreman grabbed his shoulder. "Reyes and Dominguez," the man said, his voice tight, basement level. They were running conduit. Nathan looked at the building. He looked at the foreman. He had maybe 90 seconds, and he knew it. "Call 911, Nathan said. "Tell them partial structural collapse. 2 workers unaccounted for. Possible entrapment." He handed the foreman his radio. "Don't move anyone closer." Then Nathan Carter, structural engineer, 40 years old, with absolutely no obligation and every logical reason in the world to wait for rescue teams, turned around and walked back into the building. "Nathan," the foreman shouted behind him. He was already inside. He found them on the lower level, behind a concrete pillar, pressed into a corner where a section of overhead framing had partially dropped, but hadn't fully given way. Reyes had a gash across his forehead, bleeding hard. Dominguez was holding his arm at an angle that made Nathan's stomach turn. "You two having a rough morning." Nathan kept his voice steady. "Dios mío." Dominguez breathed. "Nathan, the ceiling." "I see it." Nathan assessed the compromised section above them, saw the progression, saw what was coming. "How bad is the arm?" "Broken," Reyes said flatly, still somehow more focused than panicked. "He won't tell you, so I'm telling you." "Okay," Nathan moved to Dominguez's side. "I'm going to get you standing." "Reyes, you're going to put your hand on my back and you're going to stay exactly one step behind me. We're not running. Running creates vibration. We're going to walk fast and calm. You understand me?" Both men nodded. He had Dominguez halfway upright when the first section let go above them. It wasn't the whole ceiling. Just a portion, a cascading failure, that hit the floor 20 feet to their left and sent a concussive wave of displaced air and concrete dust that knocked all three of them sideways. Nathan shoved Dominguez into Reyes and got them both behind the pillar as something very large and very heavy grazed the back of Nathan's skull and drove him shoulder first into the floor. He heard the structure groan above him. He thought, in a very clear and almost academic way, "This is going to be bad." Then the lights went out. He didn't lose consciousness completely. Or if he did, it was in pieces, intervals of black punctuated by noise, pressure, voices, someone touching his face, someone shouting his name, the sensation of being moved, which sent white-hot pain through his left shoulder and made him grab someone's arm, hard enough to leave bruises. "Hold on," a voice said. "You're okay, you're okay." He was not okay, but he held on. The emergency room at Seattle Mercy was controlled chaos. By the time the ambulances arrived, 3 patients from the site, 1 with minor lacerations, 1 with a compound fracture of the forearm, and 1 Nathan Carter with blunt head trauma, 3 fractured ribs, a dislocated shoulder, suspected internal bleeding, and a blood pressure that had the attending nurses moving fast. He came to more fully in Trauma Bay 2, under lights that seemed unforgivably bright. He could feel his shoulder before he could form a complete sentence, could hear the rhythm of monitors before he could remember his own last name. He turned his head slowly, because everything punished him for moving, and found a room full of motion, nurses, equipment. A voice calling out numbers he understood academically, but couldn't quite connect to himself. Then the motion near his left side slowed. Someone pulled back their face shield, the kind that covered most of the face. Standard protective equipment. And, in the instant before they put it down, he registered only female. Dark hair pulled back, approximately his age. And then she leaned close to him, not clinical close, something else. Her voice was just above a whisper, like she'd measured it, just loud enough for him and no one else. "Nathan," a breath, "do you remember me?" 3 words. And 22 years collapsed like a building. His mind did something strange then. While his body continued performing whatever survival processes were keeping his blood pressure from dropping further, some other part of him went absolutely, perfectly still. He knew that voice. He hadn't heard it in over 2 decades, and he knew it the way you know a song that was playing during the most important night of your life, not consciously, deeper than that, in the part of the brain that doesn't forget the things that mattered most, no matter how much time passes. He looked at her. She straightened slightly. Her eyes were dark brown. He'd always remembered that clearly, and they were watching him with an expression that was not simply professional concern. It was something older and more complicated than that. "Claire," he said. Her name came out of him, like something he'd been holding under pressure for a very long time. Claire Bennett. She blinked. Composed herself, he could see her do it. A small, deliberate reset, and the doctor came back into her posture, even as something else stayed visible in her eyes. "You're in the emergency department at Seattle Mercy," she said, her voice clear and even. "You have a dislocated shoulder, 3 fractured ribs, a laceration on the back of your head, and we're waiting on imaging to rule out internal bleeding. You're stable. You're a doctor," he said. "Emergency medicine." She picked up a chart. "Yes, at Seattle Mercy. 12 years now." He stared at her. He couldn't help it. He'd thought about Claire Bennett at odd moments over the years, the way you think about unresolved things, but he'd never let himself think too directly or too long about her. The same way you don't stare straight at something that still has the ability to hurt you. "How are Reyes and Dominguez?" he asked. Something shifted in her expression. He'd changed the subject. She knew it. He knew she knew it. The man with the broken arm is in surgery. He'll recover fully. The other one has 14 stitches and a concussion. But he was asking for a cheeseburger in triage, which we consider a good sign. Despite everything, Nathan almost smiled. Good. He exhaled. Every breath cost him something. Good. Silence moved in between them, and it had weight. 22 years of weight. He watched her write something in the chart, and he noticed her hands the way they didn't waver, the calm and practiced motion of someone who spent her life performing under pressure. He noticed the absence of a ring on her left hand, and then immediately disliked himself for noticing. Claire. She looked up. How long have you? He stopped, reorganized. There were 60 things he wanted to ask, and none of them were appropriate, and all of them were necessary. I didn't know you were in Seattle. I moved here for residency. She closed the chart. I've been here since. You never. He stopped himself again. Her eyes held steady on his face. No, she said quietly. I never reached out. The weight of that sentence carried an entire conversation inside it. He could hear it. He thought she could too. Okay, he said, because what else was there? Lying in a hospital bed with 3 broken ribs and a shoulder that felt like it had been run through a machine press. She nodded, started to turn. Claire. She turned back. And there it was again, that flicker of something that wasn't doctor, that was older than Seattle Mercy and residency and 12 professional years. It was the girl who sat beside him in second period chemistry and understood structural equations better than anyone else in the room. Thank you, he said, for he gestured vaguely at his own wrecked body, for this. Don't thank me yet, she said, and it was almost dry. Almost the same understated humor he remembered from when they were 18. You haven't seen the imaging results. She left Trauma Bay, too, with her clipboard and her professional composure. And Nathan stared at the ceiling and felt something in his chest that had nothing to do with the fractured ribs. Over the next 4 days, Nathan Carter learned 3 things about Claire Bennett. First, she was exceptional at her job. He'd watched enough people work under pressure to recognize when someone had mastered their environment. She moved through that emergency department the way a structural engineer moves through a complex build, reading variables, recalculating, adjusting without panic, making decisions that cost no extra motion. The nurses responded to her differently. Then they responded to the other attending physicians, not with deference so much as with trust. Second, she was carrying something. He noticed it the way he noticed structural stress, not in dramatic cracks, but in small, persistent signs. The way she held tension in her shoulders when she spoke to a specific senior administrator. The way her voice went carefully neutral when certain topics came up, like she'd learned to sand down her edges in particular situations to avoid friction. Third, she kept coming back to check on him. Not just clinically, she had residence for that. She came back herself. She'd appear in the doorway in the early morning or late in a shift, ask him a question about his pain level, or his imaging, or his physical therapy progress, and sometimes the conversation would drift, just slightly, past clinical. You're still in structural engineering, she said on the 3rd day. Not a question. Yeah, nah. He adjusted himself against the pillow. His shoulder was immobilized, which made everything slightly aggravating. Always planned to be. I remember. She sat down in the chair beside the bed, not at the foot, the way the residents did, but close. The way someone sits when they're not pretending. The conversation is only professional. You used to draw load diagrams in the margins of your chemistry notes. He looked at her. You noticed that. I sat next to you for a year. Nathan, I noticed things. There was a quiet between them that felt different from the first day's heavy silence. This one had a different texture, more like the space between 2 people who are measuring it's safe to say the next true thing. You never told me you wanted emergency medicine, he said. I wasn't sure yet when she paused, redirected. I came to it slowly. It suits me. Yeah, he said. It does. She looked at him directly then. Why did you go back in? He'd been expecting the question. Multiple people had asked it: the project manager, the safety investigator, his sister on the phone, a journalist who'd shown up in the lobby and been escorted away. But from Claire, it felt different. Not like an accusation or an admiration. Like genuine need to understand. Reyes has 3 kids, Nathan said. Dominguez's wife is 8 months pregnant. That's not the reason. He looked at her. No, he admitted. Not completely. Then what is? He was quiet for a moment. I built that building. I designed that framework. I signed off on the calculations when it started to fail. Those men were inside because of decisions I was part of, even the decisions I'd objected to. He met her eyes. When something you built fails, you don't stand outside and wait for someone else to go in. She held his gaze for a long moment, and in the quality of that look, the way it was neither judgment nor simple admiration, but something more like recognition. Nathan felt something shift quietly in a chamber of himself he'd kept mostly locked for 20 years. You haven't changed, she said softly. You have, he said. You're better. Something passed across her face, not quite a smile, something more honest than a smile. She stood, smoothed her coat, picked up the chart. The doctor returned. The distance returned. He'd learned to watch for the moment. It happened, the slight shift in posture when she decided a conversation had reached its limit. Dr. Ewan will handle your morning rounds, she said. I'm on nights this week. Claire. She stopped. The hospital. He'd been watching since he arrived, picking up fragments of conversation, observing the tension in the administrative corridors visible from his room, watching the subtle politics of who spoke to whom and in what tone. He was a structural engineer. Reading the invisible forces acting on a system was his entire professional life. Something's wrong here. Beyond just a busy ER. Her expression didn't change, and that was the tell that she kept it so carefully still. You need rest, she said. That's not a no. She was quiet for just a beat too long. Get some sleep, Nathan. She walked out. He stared at the door. Somewhere below the injury, and the medication, and the strange electric discomfort of seeing her again, something else was forming. The same sensation he'd felt standing on that construction site, the low vibration beneath his feet, the building speaking before the break. Something in this hospital was under load it couldn't bear, and Claire Bennett was standing in the middle of it. On the 5th night, he woke at 2 a.m. to voices in the corridor. Not patient voices, administrative. He recognized one of them immediately, Marcus Hale, the chief executive officer of Seattle Mercy Health System, a man Nathan had seen 3 times on local business news in the last 2 years. The other voice he didn't recognize. Both were low, controlled, and unhappy. He couldn't make out words clearly. But he caught fragments. Bennett is becoming a problem. Not the time for her to be asking those questions. Make sure she understands what's at stake for her position here. The voices moved away down the corridor. Nathan lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. Bennett is becoming a problem. Claire was investigating something, or resisting something, or refusing something she was being pressured to accept. He'd seen it in her, the tension in her shoulders, the careful neutrality, the way she measured every word around certain people. And now a hospital executive was discussing her at 2 a.m. in a voice that didn't sound like a performance review. Nathan Carter had walked back into a collapsing building because of a sense of responsibility he couldn't put down. And now, lying in the dark with the broken ribs and a shoulder that throbbed with every heartbeat, he felt that same low vibration, not beneath his feet this time, but somewhere deeper, the kind that meant something is about to break, and someone needs to be paying attention. He thought about Claire's face when he'd asked about the hospital, the way she'd kept it perfectly still. Get some sleep, Nathan. He closed his eyes. He didn't sleep for a long time. He was discharged on a Thursday. Not because he was fully healed. 3 fractured ribs don't heal in a week. and his shoulder was going to need another 6 weeks in a brace before any serious physical therapy could begin. He was discharged because Nathan Carter was a terrible patient, and at some point on day 6, his attending physician, Dr. Yuen, sat down beside his bed, looked at him with the particular exhaustion of someone who had argued this point already 4 times, and said, "If I let you go home with a monitoring protocol, will you actually follow it?" "Yes," Nathan said. "You're lying." "I'm agreeing with you." "That's not the same thing." Dr. Yuen signed the discharge paperwork. Nathan's sister, Diane, drove him home and spent 40 minutes arranging his kitchen so that everything he might need was reachable without lifting his left arm above shoulder height. She was 53. Sharper than anyone gave her credit for, and she had the same dark eyes as their father eyes that missed very little and forgave even less when someone she loved did something reckless. "You ran back into the building," she said. "Not for the first time. You've mentioned that. I'm going to keep mentioning it until it stops making me want to scream." Diane. "Reyes sent flowers," she said, cutting him off with the efficiency of someone who had been redirecting his conversations for 30 years. "And Dominguez's wife called. She cried the whole time. I cried the whole time. It was a whole thing. She straightened the dish towel on the oven handle. You could have died." Nathan. "I didn't. That's not the reassurance you think it is." She left at 6, after making him promise to call her every morning before 8, a promise he intended to keep for approximately 3 days before they both forgot about it. He stood in his apartment, in the quiet that follows other people leaving, and the first thing he did was sit down at his desk, open his laptop, and search the name Seattle Mercy Health System. He told himself it was professional curiosity. He was an engineer. Systems interested him. When something was under structural stress, he wanted to understand the load and the source. He told himself that was the only reason. He didn't entirely believe himself. What came up in the search results over the next 2 hours painted a picture that confirmed what he'd felt lying in that hospital bed, watching the invisible forces move through the hallways. Seattle Mercy had undergone a major administrative restructuring 18 months ago. Before the restructuring, it had been a mid-tier regional hospital with a strong emergency department reputation and solid patient satisfaction scores. Under the leadership of Marcus Hale, who'd been brought in by a newly configured board of directors, the numbers told a different story. Physician turnover up 41% in 14 months. 3 malpractice settlements in the same period, all quietly resolved. 2 separate anonymous complaints filed with the state medical board. Details undisclosed. And a funding arrangement that had restructured the hospital's debt through a partner. Nathan couldn't trace cleanly through 3 layers of holding companies. He sat back. He'd spent his career reading blueprints, and what he was looking at right now was a blueprint for institutional failure, the kind that didn't announce itself with a single dramatic collapse, but with a long sequence of small compressions, each one individually survivable, until the cumulative load exceeded what the structure could bear. And Claire Bennett was somewhere inside that structure, holding weight she hadn't chosen to carry. He closed the laptop. He opened it again 40 seconds later and searched her name. Dr. Claire Bennett. Seattle Mercy Emergency Medicine. He found a profile on the hospital's physician directory, a conference presentation from 3 years ago on high-volume trauma protocol, and 1 article in a regional medical journal about emergency department resource allocation in underfunded urban hospitals. He read the article twice. It was careful, rigorous, and underneath the academic language, it was furious, the kind of controlled, documented fury that someone produces when they have important to say and have learned that saying it loudly only gets the door closed faster. He thought about the conversation in the corridor at 2 in the morning. Marcus Hale's voice. Bennett is becoming a problem. He thought about the way she'd kept her face perfectly still when he'd mentioned the hospital, the way she'd said, "Get some sleep, Nathan," and walked out not dismissively, but the way someone walks away from a conversation that they cannot afford to have in a place where the walls are listening. He thought about Claire Bennett at 18, sitting beside him in chemistry, understanding load-bearing equations intuitively while everyone else was still copying the formula off the board. She'd had the same quality then, the ability to see the structural reality of a thing, while other people were still looking at the surface. He pulled out his phone, stared at it, put it back down. He didn't have her number. He hadn't asked for it in the hospital because asking would have required him to acknowledge, openly, that he wanted it. And that acknowledgement carried with it 22 years of unresolved weight that he hadn't figured out how to lift with a fractured shoulder. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. The next morning, he called the hospital and left a message for Dr. Bennett thanking her for his care and asking if she could recommend a follow-up specialist for rib injuries. It was the most elaborately constructed pretextual phone call of his adult life, and he was mildly embarrassed by it, and he didn't regret it at all. She called back at 7:15 that evening. "You don't need a referral for rib fractures," she said. "You follow up with your primary care physician, and you don't do anything stupid for 6 weeks. Hello to you too." A pause, shorter than the ones in the hospital. Something in the quality of the silence between them had changed, less weight, more texture. Like it was adjusting to the fact that they were no longer physician and patient. That whatever came next didn't have a defined professional protocol. "Hello," she said, and something in her voice was almost quietly amused. "How are you?" he asked. "Busy." "The ER or?" "Both," she said. And the word landed with a flatness that told him everything she wasn't saying. He let a beat pass. "I heard something," he said carefully. "The night before I was discharged. In the corridor, Marcus Hale." The silence that followed was a different kind entirely. The weighted kind. The kind that meant he'd touched something real. "Nathan." Her voice was very even. "You should be resting." "I'm sitting down." "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant." He kept his own voice easy. "I'm not trying to push into something that isn't my business. I just want you to know that. I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear what I heard. And I'm not going to pretend I don't notice what I notice." He paused. "If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here." Another silence, longer. Then, "How's the shoulder?" He recognized the redirect, accepted it. "Uncomfortable, functional." "The ribs. They remind me they exist every time I breathe." "Which is frequently." This time she did laugh, short, real, unguarded, and the sound of it hit him somewhere under the fractured ribs in a way that had nothing to do with the injury. "You should be on anti-inflammatories," she said. "I am." "Are you eating?" Diane came by with food. "Good." A breath. "Nathan." "Yeah." "I'm glad you called." She said it carefully, like she'd measured the words before releasing them. "I wasn't sure if you would." He turned that over. "Why wouldn't I?" "Because it's easier not to." Another pause. "We went 22 years without talking. It would have been easy to let it stay that way." "Is that what you wanted?" The question came out more directly than he'd planned. He felt the exposure of it, the way it sat there in the air between them, asking more than its 4 words technically required. She was quiet long enough that he thought she might redirect again. "No," she said finally. "It's not what I wanted." He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Okay. Okay," she echoed. They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing heavy, nothing that required the careful measured language of the hospital conversations. She told him she'd done her residency at Johns Hopkins before choosing Seattle. He told her about the Meridian Project, the earlier disputes with the project director, the safety report that had been overruled. She listened the way she'd always listened, completely, without filling silences unnecessarily, in a way that made him say more than he'd planned. Because the attention felt safe. When she said she had to go early shift the next morning, there was a quality to the goodbye that neither of them named, but both of them felt. The sense that the conversation was not finished, that it had started something that was going to need more room than a phone call could hold. "Claire," he said before she hung up. "Yeah, I'm going to want to have a real conversation at some point. Not about my ribs." A pause. "I know. Just when you're ready." She was quiet for a moment then. "I'll call you." She did, 3 days later. And conversation that followed was the first of what became, without either of them formally deciding it, a pattern. She called in the evenings, after her shift. When the particular exhaustion of the emergency department had settled into the quieter register that comes after sustained pressure, he answered, and they talked. And the subjects drifted between present and past, the way conversations do when two people are trying to map the distance between who they were and who they became. It was on the fourth call that the past finally pushed its way through. They'd been talking about his recovery. He'd started walking longer distances, was sleeping better. The ribs were downgrading from sharp to dull when she went quiet in the middle of a sentence. Not the comfortable quiet, the pressurized kind. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always." After graduation, she stopped, started again. "I wrote to you. That summer, 3 letters. I never." She stopped again, and he could hear her composing herself with the same deliberateness he'd watched her used spinus in the trauma bay. "I never heard anything back." The words landed in his chest like something falling from a height. He sat very still. "I didn't get any letters," he said. Silence. "Nathan. Claire." He kept his voice steady because one of them needed to be. "I wrote to you. Twice that summer. After you left for." He paused. "Where did you go?" "Right after graduation. My father took us to my grandmother's in Connecticut. The whole summer." He said. She stopped. He said it was a family trip. He'd planned it for months. Nathan's hand tightened slightly on the phone. He'd never mentioned it before graduation. "No. To me or to you." A longer silence. And in that silence, something shifted between them, the quiet reordering of a shared timeline that had, until 30 seconds ago, been carrying different versions of the same story. "He told me the week before graduation," she said slowly. "He said it was already arranged." "You didn't know before that?" "No, Nathan." "What?" "After Connecticut," he said. "Did you come back to Seattle?" "I went straight to college orientation in August." "I didn't." Her voice thinned. "I didn't come back to the house until Thanksgiving, and by then your family had moved. We moved in September, my dad's job transfer. I didn't have a forwarding address, and you didn't." She stopped. "I thought you didn't write back because you'd..." She didn't finish the sentence, but he heard the shape of it. "Because you'd moved on, because it wasn't important enough, because the things we said that last night meant less to you than they did to me. I thought you left without saying goodbye," he said. "I thought you'd..." He echoed her unfinished sentence back at her without intending to. "I thought I'd misread everything, that I'd been wrong about what that night was." The silence that followed was enormous, not empty, full of 22 years of a story both of them had been carrying in the wrong direction. "We were both missing the same letters," she said finally, quietly. "Yeah. That's not..." She stopped. "That's not a coincidence, Nathan." "No," he said, "it's not." Neither of them said the next part out loud. Not yet. Because the next part required more than a phone call. It required looking at each other in the same room and saying the thing that two people say when they've spent 20 years believing a lie that someone else constructed for them. "I need to think," she said. "I know. I'm not a breath. I'm not ready to." "Claire." He kept his voice very calm. "Take your time." She hung up shortly after, and Nathan sat in the dark of his apartment, with the phone in his hand and the low vibration running through him again. Not the warning kind this time, something else. The vibration of something buried for 20 years beginning to surface, slowly, through 22 years of soil. He thought about her father, Richard Bennett. He met them perhaps 4 times during high school. A precise, controlled man who spoke in complete sentences and watched the space around his daughter with the particular vigilance of someone managing an asset rather than raising a child. Nathan had never been comfortable around him, had always sensed, without being able to articulate it at 18, that Richard Bennett had already decided Nathan Carter was not a variable he was willing to permit in his daughter's future. A week passed, then too, Claire called, but the subject didn't return directly. They orbited it, talked around its edges, their conversations carrying a shared awareness of something unresolved at the center. He gave her the room, he'd learned, in the years he'd spent building things, that you cannot rush structural processes, you can apply pressure and heat. But some bonds form on their own timeline, and forcing them early only produces fracture. Meanwhile, he healed, slowly. The ribs progressed from dull to occasional. His shoulder graduated from immobilization to limited movement. He went back to his desk and back to his work remotely, light duty, reviewing documentation and consulting on projects without site visits. He kept reading about Seattle Mercy. He started building a clearer picture of the board's financial arrangements, the timeline of physician departures, the pattern of administrative decisions that had systematically prioritized revenue over patient throughput. He wasn't doing anything with the information yet. He was just watching, reading the load. It was on a Wednesday evening, 5 weeks after his discharge, that Claire called at 9 instead of her usual 7. Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard in it before, not the measured professional register, not the careful personal register. Something rawer. He was there today, she said, without preamble. Who? Hale. He came down to the department. Not for patient care, he never comes down for patient care. He had 2 board members with him. A pause. He introduced me to them. Very cordial, very deliberate. He told them, I was one of the department's most valuable physicians. Another pause. And then he looked at me and said, We're counting on your continued partnership, Claire. This is such a critical time for the institution. Nathan said nothing. Let her continue. He said it in front of my entire team, she said. In front of my residents. It was so smooth, so polished. And everyone smiled. And they shook hands. And they left. And my charge nurse, Maria, came up to me afterward and said, Dr. Bennett, are you all right? Because apparently the color went out of my face. What was he telling you? Nathan asked, though he understood it already. That he knows, she said flatly. That I've been asking questions about resource allocation, about why certain medications are being restricted, about why the overnight staffing is down 23% from protocol. He knows I've been talking to the physicians who left, and he was telling me, in that very polished, very cordial way, that I need to stop. Nathan's voice stayed steady. How long have you been keeping records of this? A pause. What makes you think I've been keeping records? Because you're you, he said simply. The silence that followed carried something warm beneath the tension. 8 months, she said. I have documentation, staffing logs, resource allocation discrepancies, 3 patient outcomes that should have triggered internal review and didn't. And she stopped. And I don't know who to trust inside that building. The physicians who might have supported this, 2 of them are already gone. The ones who are left have families and mortgages. And her voice tightened. I understand why they're quiet. I'm not angry at them. But you can't be quiet. Nathan, her voice was very still. 3 weeks ago, we had a 47-year-old man come through the ER. Chest pain, elevated troponins, classic MI presentation. He needed a cath lab. We have a cath lab. We have the team. Protocol is clear. A pause. He waited 4 hours because the on-call cardiologist had been cut to a single overnight shift covering 3 departments and was handling 2 other cases simultaneously. A longer pause. He survived. But the damage to his cardiac muscle was... She stopped. Claire. I cannot be quiet, she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been looking at the board's financial structure. Silence, sharp this time. Nathan. Nonprofit designation. private equity involvement through a holding company registered in Delaware, and at least 2 board members who sit on the investment committee of the same fund. He kept his voice even. That's a conflict of interest that the State Oversight Board should have flagged. It wasn't. Which means either it was disclosed and waived, or it wasn't disclosed. How did you? Public records, financial filings. It takes time, not access. Nathan, if you start pulling on that thread, the people attached to it are going to notice. A beat. These aren't small people. I know. They have lawyers and board influence, and she stopped. How long have you been looking at this? Since I got home from the hospital. Another silence, and in it, he could hear her recalibrating, reassessing something about him, or about the situation, or about both. Why? She asked. It was a simple question. It required a simple answer, and the simple answer was the true one, and the true one was the one that acknowledged something he'd been dancing around since the moment she whispered his name in Trauma Bay 2. Because you're standing in the middle of something that's going to come down, he said, and I know what it looks like when a structure fails, and I'm not going to stand outside and wait. Silence, long, full, warm at the edges. You said the same thing about the building, she said softly. Yeah, you almost died. Yeah. Another silence. Okay, she said finally. Okay. Okay. A breath, not surrender. Something firmer than that. The sound of a decision being made. Then we need to talk. In person. Name the place, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, there's a coffee shop on Eastlake. Mornings, before 9. Hale doesn't come in until 10, and he sends his assistant for coffee. A beat. I'll be there Saturday, 7:30. I'll be there. She hung up. Nathan set down the phone and looked at the wall across from him, at the large-scale city plan he'd tacked up weeks ago, with the hospital circled in red marker. Financial connections mapped out in blue ink lines that connected to names and dates, and amounts that no one had publicly assembled yet. He thought about Claire in that emergency department. 8 months of documentation, standing in front of Marcus Hale's polished smile, keeping her face still, keeping her voice level, holding the weight of it alone, because she didn't know who else could be trusted with it. He thought about the man who'd waited 4 hours for a cath lab that was right there. He thought about 2 letters sent in the summer, after graduation, that never arrived, and 3 letters answered with silence. He thought about a rainy night after the graduation ceremony, when 2 18-year-olds had sat on a bench overlooking the river and said things to each other that felt, at the time, like the beginning of something that would last. And someone had decided that it wouldn't. He stood up, wincing at the protest from his ribs, and walked to the window. Seattle at night, the city lights blurred slightly by the same perpetual drizzle that had been there the morning everything started. It looked like every other night from up here, the kind of ordinary that conceals enormous pressure in its structures, the kind that requires someone to pay attention to what's working underneath, what's carrying weight it was never designed to carry, what's one increment from giving way. He knew how to read that. He'd learned it from buildings. But the truth was, he'd started learning it from a girl in second-period chemistry who sat beside him for a year and understood load-bearing equations intuitively, and noticed the diagrams he drew in the margins of his notes, and never made him feel like that was strange. Saturday was 4 days away. He had a lot to put together before then. He went back to his desk. Saturday arrived the way important mornings tend to, quietly, without announcement, with no external sign that it carried more weight than any other day. Nathan was at the coffee shop on Eastlake at 7:15, not because he was anxious, he told himself, because he was someone who arrived early to things. That was simply how he operated. He ordered black coffee, found a table in the back corner where the sight lines were good, and the ambient noise would cover conversation, and sat down with his folder of documents and the particular stillness of a man who has prepared as thoroughly as he knows how and is now waiting for the thing he prepared for to actually begin. Claire walked in at 7:28. She was in street clothes, dark jeans, a gray coat. Her hair down in a way he hadn't seen it during the hospital days when it was always pulled back and secured. She looked different, not less professional, less armored. She scanned the room, found him, and something in her posture shifted. In a way he wasn't sure, she was aware of a slight loosening, a breath that she let go before she reached the table. She sat down across from him. "You're early," she said. "So are you." She looked at the folder in front of him, then at him. "You've been busy." "I had 6 weeks of not being allowed to lift anything," he said. "Reading doesn't require shoulder mobility." She ordered coffee from the server, who appeared, and when the server left, she leaned forward slightly, her hands wrapped around the mug before it was even filled, and she said, "Show me." He opened the folder. What followed was 40 minutes that felt both longer and shorter than 40 minutes, the compressed, high-density time of two people, working through something complicated that they've both been thinking about separately, and are now assembling together for the first time. Nathan walked her through the financial structure he'd mapped, the board composition, the private equity connection, the Delaware holding company, the conflict of interest that should have triggered state disclosure and either hadn't or had been buried in a filing that nobody had thought to look for yet. Claire listened without interrupting. She had that quality he'd noticed at 18 and again in the hospital: complete, focused attention that made the person talking feel like every word was being received and filed and taken seriously. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled her own folder out of her bag. "I have the internal staffing logs," she said. 8 months. "I've been printing a copy of every shift roster before the system updates at midnight, because twice now the next morning's version has had different numbers than the night before." Nathan looked at her. "Someone is editing the records retroactively," she said flatly, "to hide the understaffing. To hide the fact that they're billing at full staffing rates to Medicare and Medicaid while running at 60 to 70% of required coverage." She slid 3 pages across the table. "This is April. This is May. This is the first 2 weeks of June. Every date where the logged physician count and the billed service count don't match." He looked at the pages. He was a structural engineer, not a healthcare fraud investigator. But the pattern was immediately legible, the same kind of systematic discrepancy he'd have recognized in any complex systems documentation. Small individual gaps that became irrefutable in aggregate. "Claire," he looked up. "This isn't just mismanagement." "No," she said, "it's not. This is fraud. Federal fraud. If they're billing Medicare." "Yes." He leaned back. "You've been sitting on this for how long?" "I started keeping records 8 months ago, but I didn't fully understand what I was looking at until about 2 months ago. When I did," she paused, "I contacted a healthcare attorney, confidentially. She confirmed that what I have constitutes the basis for a federal whistleblower complaint, a beat. She also told me that the personal and professional risk for the complainant is significant, that these processes take time, that the hospital would almost certainly move to terminate my position the moment a complaint was filed, and that while the law provides certain protections, those protections take time to activate. And Hale's visit to your department was a warning." Yes, her jaw was tight. "He knows I'm asking questions. He doesn't know how much documentation I have, but he's making clear that the window for me to quietly fall back into line is still open." Nathan looked at her steadily. "But you're not going to." It wasn't a question. He knew the answer. He'd known it since she said, "I cannot be quiet" on the phone. And honestly, he'd known it since in the emergency department. The woman who kept 8 months of stowing logs because 3 of her patients had outcomes that shouldn't have happened. She met his eyes. "No, I'm not." Something settled between them. Not tension. The opposite of tension, the solid, weight-bearing feeling of 2 people standing on the same side of something difficult. Then let's figure out how to do this in a way that doesn't get you buried, he said. She exhaled. And in that exhale was every week of carrying this alone, every shift she'd worked while holding this knowledge, every conversation with Hale she'd navigated with a carefully empty face, every night she'd gone home and add another entry to the folder in her bag. "Okay," she said, "tell me what you're thinking." They stayed at that table for another hour and a half, the coffee and partly emptied around them. Neither of them fully noticed. They built the shape of it together, what she had, what he'd found, what was still missing, what needed to be verified before it went anywhere. He knew a former colleague who now worked in the state attorney general's office. She knew a physician who'd left Seattle Mercy 4 months ago and had been unreachable since, possibly pressured into silence, possibly simply exhausted, but worth trying to contact again. The healthcare attorney she'd spoken to could escalate to a federal whistleblower filing if the Medicare fraud angle held. At 9:15, she looked at her phone and said, "I have to go. I'm on at 11. He nodded. They gathered their folders. She stood. And he stood. And there was a moment, the particular moment that happens when two people have just been very honest with each other about something consequential and are now transitioning back into the ordinary logistics of the day. The moment where neither of them quite knows what the social protocol is, because the social protocol hadn't been defined for this situation. She looked at him. "Nathan," she said. "Yeah." "The letters." She said it simply, directly, without building up to it. "I need to know what you think happened." He was quiet for a moment. "You said your father arranged the Connecticut trip the week before graduation, suddenly, without prior notice." "Yes." "And neither of us received what the other sent." "Yes." "And the same family," he said slowly, "that controlled your schedule that summer, now has board representation at the hospital where you've spent your career." He let that sit. "Richard Bennett. Is he connected to the board?" She went very still. "His firm," she said. "His investment firm is one of the limited partners in the private equity fund you found." She said it like she'd known it and hadn't wanted to say it out loud, because saying it out loud made it fully real. "I recognized the name when I saw your documents. I've been sitting with that since Thursday." Nathan said nothing. Let her get there on her own. "He has always had opinions about my career," she said. Her voice was carefully level, the ER doctor voice. The one that stayed even when the numbers were bad. About which hospital, which position, about my— She stopped, pressed her lips together. "About my relationships." "Your engagement," Nathan said quietly. Her eyes came up fast. "How did you? You had a ring. When you started at Seattle Mercy 12 years ago, there's a photo in the conference presentation from 3 years back, no ring." It's a wide enough gap that he stopped himself. "I'm sorry, I was putting pieces together. I shouldn't have." "His name was David Harmon," she said. "He was a physician at Seattle Mercy, cardiology. My father introduced us." She said it with a flatness that made each sentence feel like something being set down heavily. "We were engaged for 2 years. He left Seattle Mercy and me at the same time. 14 months ago." A pause. "He's one of the physicians I've been trying to reach." The ones who left. Nathan processed that. All of it, the shape of it. "Claire," he kept his voice steady, "I need to ask you something. And I need you to know I'm not asking to upset you. I'm asking because I think it's important. Ask. Was David Harmon leaving you connected to whatever's happening at that hospital?" She held his gaze for a long, long moment. "I don't know," she said. "And that's the part that scares me the most." The rest of it they both left unspoken, because the coffee shop was full, and neither of them was ready to say the full shape of what they were both beginning to see, that Richard Bennett, precise, controlled. Managing his daughter's variables, had spent 22 years engineering Claire's professional and personal life, from the architecture outward, that the hospital wasn't separate from the letters, that nothing was separate from anything. She left at 9:20. He watched her walk out and sat back down and stared at the table for a moment. And then he packed his folder, put money on the table, and pulled out his phone to call the number he had for his Hong Kong cat at the Attorney General's office. He had work to do. The next 10 days moved fast. Nathan, operating on improved but still limited physical capacity, worked his phone and his laptop with the focused intensity of someone who has identified a structural failure and is now in the business of documenting it before the collapse happens. His contact at the Attorney General's office, a man named Pat Gorman, who'd been a colleague before a mid-career pivot that Nathan had thought was eccentric at the time and now respected enormously. Listened to the overview Nathan gave him on a 40-minute call and was quiet for a moment 40 afterward. You understand that what you're describing, if it bears out, is a serious federal exposure, Pat said. Yes. And the physician at the center of this is a personal acquaintance of yours. Yes. Nathan. A pause. Are you sure you're not? Pat, he kept his voice level. I've been looking at the financial filings for 5 weeks. The pattern is real. It doesn't require me to be emotionally involved to be real. A pause. Send me what you have. He sent it that afternoon. Claire, meanwhile, made contact with David Harmon. Not easily, it took 4 days. A message through a mutual colleague, and a callback that came at 11 at night from a blocked number. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. She told Nathan about it the next evening, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who has just received a confirmation they'd half hoped wouldn't come. He knew, she said, about the billing discrepancies. He found them 8 months before I did 2 years ago. He went to Hale directly. He thought she stopped. Started again. He thought going through proper channels was the right approach. Hale brought in the board. The board's legal counsel met with David and presented him with a separation agreement, confidentiality clause, financial settlement, non-disparagement. A pause. He signed it. He couldn't talk to you because of the NDA, Nathan said. He said leaving me was. Her voice thinned slightly. He said leaving me was the only way to protect me from being implicated in whatever he knew if he stayed. The association could have been used against both of us. A beat. He thought he was protecting me. Nathan was quiet. I don't know if I believe that, she said, but I don't know that I don't, either. A long pause. The settlement was structured through a legal entity connected to my father's firm. There it was, fully, the whole shape of it, visible now. Nathan said nothing for a moment, then, Claire, I'm sorry. Don't. Her voice was sharp for just a second, then softer. I need to be angry about it before I'm sorry about it. I'll get to sorry. Right now I'm angry. Okay. At my father. At Hale. She stopped. He could hear her breathing, controlled and deliberate. The same rhythm she used in the trauma bay, when a situation required her to stay functional under pressure. 22 years. Nathan. My father has been managing me like a portfolio position for 22 years. And her voice broke. Just slightly. At the edge. I let him. Because I didn't know. Because I trusted. She stopped. You trusted your father, Nathan said quietly. That's not something you should have to defend. Silence, heavy and warm at the same time. The letters, she said. You're sure you sent them? 2 letters. That summer. June and July. I put them in the mailbox myself. He intercepted them. She said it without question. Statement. And the ones I sent you. He would have needed someone, at your end or mine, to intercept mine, Nathan said. Or he had the forwarding address and rerouted them. It wouldn't have been complicated for someone with the right connections and enough motivation. He paused. Claire, who did he use? For the kind of things he didn't want to do directly. She was quiet for a moment. Then his assistant, Gerald Marsh. He's been with my father for 30 years. He handles. She stopped. He handles everything my father doesn't want to put his own name on. Is Marsh still with him? Yes. Okay, Nathan said. I need you to do something, and I need you to trust me. What? Don't confront your father yet. Not until we have everything in order. If he knows, we're connecting the hospital to the letters to the Bennett family investment position. He will move, and when he moves, the first thing he'll do is make your job disappear, and the second thing he'll do is make the evidence harder to access. She was quiet. I've been wanting to call him since Thursday. I know. Every day since Thursday, I've picked up the phone. And, Claire, I know. I know. I won't. A pause that carried enormous weight. But Nathan, how long? 2 weeks, he said. Give Pat Gorman 2 weeks to assess what we have. If it's strong enough, we file simultaneously the federal whistleblower complaint and the state conflict of interest disclosure. Once those are filed, your father's position becomes much more complicated. He can still make things difficult, but he can't make you disappear. Silence. 2 weeks, she said finally. 2 weeks. She hung up. And Nathan sat in the quiet of his apartment, feeling the full weight of what was moving now, the sense of something enormous in motion, not yet visible on the surface, but building pressure in all the load-bearing places. He'd felt it before, always right before the break. He knew the difference now, between the kind of structural failure that kills people and the kind that clears out the rot so the building can be rebuilt right. He'd spent his career on the first kind, preventing it, containing it, surviving it when prevention failed. What was coming at Seattle Mercy was going to be the second kind. Painful, public, necessary. But between now and then was 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, he had to hold Claire steady and hold the evidence intact and hold the shape of something that could very easily collapse before it was ready. He was thinking about all of this on a Thursday evening, 11 days into the 2 weeks, when his phone rang. Not Claire, Diane. There's something you need to see, his sister said, without greeting. Her voice had a quality he recognized, the carefully controlled register, that meant she was moderating something stronger underneath. I'm sending you a link. The link arrived 30 seconds later. A local business news item posted that afternoon. Seattle Mercy Health's Board of Directors announces expanded strategic partnership. Investor confidence remains strong following physician retention challenges. It was a preemptive press piece, public positioning, before whatever Hale expected was coming. Framing the physician departures as a managed transition, framing the financial restructuring as growth strategy. The kind of document that gets prepared a crisis communications team that has been told to expect scrutiny and has decided to control the narrative before the scrutiny arrives. Which meant Hale knew something was coming. Nathan called Pat Gorman immediately. They know, he said without preamble. I saw it, Pat said. It doesn't change what we have. It actually strengthens the case for moving quickly. They're aware that there's exposure, and they're attempting to pre-frame. A pause. Nathan, I need 3 more days to complete the preliminary assessment. Then we talk. 3 days. 3 days. He called Claire next. She'd already seen it. Her voice was tight. How did they know? We may have a leak somewhere. Or Hale is just smart enough to prepare for the possibility. And this is preemptive rather than reactive. He kept his voice even. Claire, it doesn't change what we do. It just means we move when Pat is ready. Not before, and not after. If they move against me before then we file immediately. Regardless of readiness, he said. Pat knows that. Silence. Nathan. Her voice shifted, still tight. But underneath the tightness, something else. Something that had nothing to do with Hale or the press release or the board. Something older. If this goes wrong, it won't. But if it does, if I lose my position, if the board comes after my license, if my father, she stopped, I need you to know that I don't regret it. Any of it. The documentation. The contact with Gorman. Any of it. A pause. Or the other part. He knew what she meant by the other part. The Saturday morning at the coffee shop. The phone calls. The gradual, careful, genuine reconstruction of something that had been severed by someone who had no right to sever it. Neither do I, he said. The silence that followed was different from all the other silences. It was the kind that doesn't require filling. The kind that is itself a form of communication between people who have known each other long enough, in the deep way, to let it breathe. 3 days, she said finally. 3 days. He hung up. 2 days later, Pat Gorman called him at 6 in the morning. "I need you and your physician contact in my office tomorrow at 9, he said. "And Nathan, don't say anything to anyone else until then. Is it strong enough?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell him everything before the words did. "What you have," Pat said carefully, "is strong enough to take the building down." Nathan Carter stood in the early morning quiet of his apartment and felt the low vibration beneath his feet. Not the warning kind, not the collapse kind, the other kind. The kind that comes right before something that has been wrong for a very long time finally gives way. He'd felt it once before in his career, on a different project, when a structure he'd refused to sign off on was eventually condemned and demolished, and replaced with something built correctly. It didn't feel like victory, that moment. It felt like grief and relief at the same time, in equal measure. This felt like that. And underneath it, quieter but no less real, it felt like something else, the slow, specific sensation of a door that had been closed for 22 years, standing fractionally, carefully, open again, not all the way, not without cost, but open, unmistakably, irrevocably open. He texted Claire. Pat called. 9 tomorrow. It's enough. Then he put down the phone and went to make coffee, and stood at the window, watching Seattle wake up below him, ordinary and unknowing, the way cities are right before something changes. He thought about 2 letters in a mailbox in June and 2 letters that went somewhere they were never supposed to go. He thought about a precise, controlled man who had watched his daughter and made calculations and decided, 22 years ago, that Nathan Carter was a variable he was not willing to permit. Tomorrow, that calculation was going to stop mattering. Tomorrow, a different kind of structure would begin. Pat Gorman's office was on the 14th floor of a building that smelled like old law books and fresh coffee. And when Nathan and Claire walked in together at 8:57 on a Friday morning, Pat looked at both of them for a moment before he said anything, the evaluating look of a man who has spent 20 years reading rooms for a living. "You two came together," he said. "We drove separately," Claire said. "That's not what I meant." Pat gestured to the 2 chairs across from his desk. "Sit down. We have a lot to cover." He had a legal pad covered in tight handwriting and 3 separate file folders arranged in a precise row on his desk. Nathan recognized the organizational system of a man who at the end of and was now already made his assessment, preparing to deliver it, not still working through it, but ready to present conclusions. "Let me start with what we have," Pat said, "and then want to talk about what we do with it, because those are 2 different conversations, and both of them matter." He opened the first folder. The financial structure Nathan identified is real, and it is problematic. Saddle Mercy's board of directors includes 2 members who hold investment positions in the private equity fund that restructured the hospital's debt 18 months ago. That restructuring generated fees for the fund. The board members voted to approve the restructuring without disclosing their positions. Under Washington state nonprofit governance law, that is a clear conflict of interest violation. Under federal regulations governing nonprofit hospitals that receive Medicare and Medicaid funding, it triggers mandatory disclosure requirements that were not met. He looked up. That alone is a significant legal exposure for the board and for Hale as the executive who implemented the restructuring. Claire leaned forward slightly. "And the billing discrepancies." "That," Pat said, "is where it gets federal." He opened the second folder. "What you've documented, Dr. Bennett, across 8 months of staffing logs, represents a systematic pattern of billing Medicare and Medicaid for physician services at staffing levels that were not actually maintained. In regulatory language, that's false claims submission. The False Claims Act allows private citizens called relators to file suit on behalf of the federal government. The government then investigates, and if they choose to intervene and the case succeeds, the relator is entitled to a portion of the recovery. He paused. The potential recovery in a case of this scale could be in the tens of millions of dollars. The room was quiet for a moment. "I'm not doing this for money," Claire said. Her voice was flat and direct. "I know that," Pat said, without any condescension. "I'm telling you, because you need to understand what you're stepping into. Cases of this magnitude attract attention. From the government, yes, but also from the defendants. Hale will hire the most aggressive healthcare defense firm in the state the moment a complaint is filed. Your father's firm will be pulled into the conflict of interest investigation, whether he cooperates or not. This is not a quiet process. I understand that." Pat looked at her steadily. "And your position at Seattle Mercy?" "Gone the moment I file, yes, I know. Legally, you have whistleblower protections under the False Claims Act. Practically, those protections take time and litigation to enforce. In the interim, I've been preparing for that," she said. "I have enough to sustain myself while this proceeds. I'm not filing because I expect it to be comfortable." Pat held her gaze for another moment. Then he nodded once. With the particular respect of a man who has seen a lot of people in high-stakes situations and can tell the difference between genuine resolve and performed bravery. "All right," he said. He opened the third folder. "Then here's how we proceed." The next 90 minutes were the most densely information packed Nathan had experienced since the days immediately following the construction collapse, except that those days had been reactive. Emergency response. Managing a situation already in progress. This was different. This was architecture. The deliberate, careful construction of a structure designed to bear enormous load without failing. Pat walked them through the filing sequence. The federal whistleblower complaint first, submitted under seal, which meant it would be confidential during the government's initial investigation period. Simultaneously, a state conflict of interest complaint filed with the Washington Attorney General's Nonprofit Oversight Division. Nathan would submit a separate, formal complaint regarding the safety report he'd filed on the Meridian Project. A document that the same corporate culture of overriding professional safety concerns for financial reasons was not unique to Seattle Mercy. "I also want to contact 3 of the physicians who left Seattle Mercy in the last 18 months, Pat said. "Not Harmon, he's under NDA, and we don't want to expose him to breach claims. But 3 others whose departures I've reviewed. I believe at least 2 of them have information they would share if properly approached." "Dr. Ewan," Claire said quietly. Hayden looked at her. She was looking at the table. "He left 6 months ago. He was my attending in the emergency department for 4 years. When he left, he hugged me and said, 'Take care of yourself, Claire, whatever that requires.'" I didn't understand what he meant at the time. "Do you have contact information?" "Yes." Pat made a note. "Good. I'll reach out through proper legal channels." He put his pen down. "I need to be honest with both of you about timing. We can file within the week. The government's investigation could take anywhere from 3 months to 2 years. The state complaint moves faster, potentially 60 to 90 days for an initial finding. The period between filing and resolution is going to be difficult for both of you in different ways." Nathan glanced at Claire. She was looking at Pat with the steady, clear-eyed focus he'd come to recognize as her version of bracing, not rigid, not fearful, but grounded. The way someone looks when they've already made the decision and are now simply receiving information about the road they've chosen. "File it," she said. Pat looked at Nathan. "File it," Nathan said. Pat nodded. "I'll have the paperwork ready by Wednesday. I'll need both of you to review and sign before submission." He closed the folders. "One more thing." He looked at Claire directly. "Your father. At some point in this process, the Bennett family investment position in the fund is going to surface. It will surface publicly. I want you to be prepared for that. And I want you to be prepared for the possibility that he will contact you before you're ready for that conversation. Claire was quiet for a moment. I'll be ready, she said. There was something in the way she said it that told Nathan she was nowhere near ready, and also that she would be. Both things were simultaneously true, and he understood that, and he said nothing. They left Pat's office at 11:15. They stood on the sidewalk outside the building in a gray Seattle morning, and both of them were quiet for a particular silence of people with the particular silence. Heaped house, you can yet sweat, something large and irreversible in motion. Are you all right? Nathan asked. Ask me in 6 months, she said, but she almost smiled when she said it. I'll do that, he paused. Claire, whatever happens between now and then, you're not doing this alone. She looked at him, directly, the way she'd looked at him in the hospital that first day, not clinically, not with professional distance, but with the older look. The one that predated Seattle Mercy and residency, and all 22 years of constructed distance. I know, she said. They walked to their separate cars. The complaint was filed on a Wednesday, as Pat had promised, under seal, confidential, no public announcement, no press, to the outside world. Nothing changed. Claire went to work Thursday morning and walked through the emergency department and did her job with the same composed precision she brought every day. She treated 11 patients, supervised 2 residents, and at 2 in the afternoon, responded to a request for a meeting with Marcus Hale by sending a reply through his assistant, saying she was available Friday at 9. She told Nathan that evening, he doesn't know yet, she said. Or if he does, he doesn't know the scope. He probably just wants to apply more pressure. Another cordial warning. How do you feel about the meeting? Like I've already won the argument, she said. And I'm attending a meeting where the other person hasn't found out yet. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then, Claire, that's either very brave or slightly terrifying. Can it be both? Yes, he said, it absolutely can. The Friday meeting with Hale lasted 12 minutes. Claire told Nathan about it afterward in the kind of precise, sequential detail that she'd been processing it and organizing it since the moment she walked out of his office. Hale had been cordial. He'd offered coffee. He'd expressed appreciation for her dedication to the department. He'd framed the conversation as a strategic discussion about the hospital's future direction, and then, with the smooth certainty of a man who had been applying this particular kind of pressure successfully for years, he'd told her that a physician's public profile was a critical component of institutional trust, and that recent questions she'd been asking, he didn't specify which questions had created some concern at the board level about alignment. He said, alignment, Claire repeated, and Nathan could hear the contempt under the even tone. He meant compliance. What did you say? I told him I was fully committed to the highest standard of patient care at Seattle Mercy. A pause. Which is true. And I told him that I shared his interest in maintaining institutional trust. Another pause. Which is also true, in a way he wasn't intending. And he looked at me for a moment, that very controlled, very evaluating look, and then he smiled and said he was glad we were on the same page. A beat, and then I left. He's going to keep watching you. I know. But he doesn't know the complaint is already filed. And by the time he finds out, she stopped. By the time he finds out, the government has it, Nathan finished. Yes. 11 days after the filing. At 7:40 on a Tuesday evening, Claire's phone rang. She was at home. She looked at the screen, and the name on it stopped her breath for a moment before she answered. Her father. She answered on the third ring. Dad. Claire. Richard Bennett's voice was exactly what it had always been measured, deliberate. Each word placed with the precision of a man who had never in his adult life said something he hadn't already evaluated. I think it's time we talked. She was quiet for one beat. 2 then. Yes, she said, I think so too. I'd like you to come to the house. Sunday dinner. No, she said, simply flatly. without apology. A pause. The pause of a man who was not accustomed to know, from this particular direction. Claire, if you want to talk, Dad, I'll meet you somewhere neutral, not the house. She kept her voice even. And I'll be bringing someone. Another pause, longer. Who? Nathan Carter. The silence that followed was the longest and most informative silence of the entire conversation. 3 seconds in which Richard Bennett did not speak, which, for Richard Bennett, was the equivalent of any other man dropping something and gasping. "See," he said finally. "Sunday," she said. 1 o'clock. Waterfront Grill. If you'd like to talk, be there. If not," she stopped. "If not, then we talk when the Attorney General's office calls you. Your choice." She hung up. She called Nathan immediately. "He knows," she said. "I figured. Are you okay?" She stopped. Breathed. "I'm shaking," she said, with a kind of surprised honesty, like the shaking had caught her off guard. "Not from fear, my hands are shaking." "That's adrenaline," he said. "It means you did the hard thing. It passes." He went quiet when I said your name. "Yeah. 22 years. Nathan." He heard your name, and he went quiet, she stopped again, like he knew exactly who you were. "He always knew who I was," Nathan said quietly. "That was the problem." Sunday arrived the way hard things arrive, with the ordinary brightness of a day that does not acknowledge its own weight. Nathan picked Claire up at 12:30. She was in a dark blue dress, and her hair was pulled back, and she looked prepared. Carefully for a confrontation they'd been waiting. 22 cheers, to have composed on the surface, with something volcanic underneath. "You don't have to come in with me if you don't want to," she said, as he drove. "I want to," he said. "He's going to try to control the conversation. He's very good at it." "I know," he glanced at her. "So are you." She looked at him. Something in her face shifted, the slight, unguarded loosening that happened sometimes in their quieter moments. "When did you figure that out?" "Second period chemistry," he said. "You were better at managing Dr. Perkins' classroom energy than he was, and you did it without him ever noticing." She almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. He was a terrible teacher. The worst, Nathan agreed. "You're going to be fine." Richard Bennett was already seated when they arrived. Nathan had not seen the man in 22 years, and time had done what time does. The hair was silver now, the face more deeply set, but the posture was identical, straight-backed, controlled, occupying the chair with the deliberate stillness of someone who is always, consciously, the most composed person in any room. He looked at Nathan for exactly 2 seconds, the look of a man recalculating. "Nathan," he said, with a courtesy so polished it was almost indistinguishable from warmth. "Mr. Bennett," Nathan said, and sat down. Claire sat beside Nathan, and Richard Bennett looked at his daughter with an expression that was attempting to be paternal and landing somewhere closer to strategic. "You look well," he said. "Dad," her voice was quiet, not aggressive, not wavering. Somewhere between those two things, the voice of a woman who has stopped performing for her audience. "I'm not here for pleasantries. I know about Gerald Marsh. I know about the letters. I know about the fund's position in Seattle Mercy. And I know that David Harmon's separation agreement was structured through an entity connected to your firm." Richard Bennett's face went through something remarkable in those 5 seconds. Nathan watched it happen, the controlled man's equivalent of an impact. The expression didn't shatter. It just tightened, consolidated, became something harder and smaller and more careful. "Claire," he said, "you're drawing connections that. Are they wrong?" she asked. He was quiet. "Any of them," she said. "Tell me I'm wrong." He picked up his water glass, set it down, aligned it with the edge of the table in a motion so habitual it was clearly unconscious, the behavior of a man who arranges things when he needs a moment to think. "I made decisions," he said finally, "that I believed were in your best interest. You intercepted Nathan's letters." Her voice didn't rise. You arranged a summer trip to prevent us from seeing each other after graduation. You introduced me to a man who worked at the hospital your firm had financial interest in. And when that man found evidence of fraud, you facilitated his departure and his silence. She paused. Which of those was in my best interest? All of them, Richard Bennett said. And the certainty in his voice was extraordinary, the unshaken conviction, a man who has explained his own motivations to himself so many times that he has confused self-justification with truth. Nathan Carter was 22 years old with a state school degree and no family connections and no clear future. You had every opportunity in front of you. I was not going to let a teenage infatuation derail. Stop. Claire's voice cut across his with a quiet force that made him actually stop mid-sentence. Nathan had never heard her use that specific register before. It wasn't loud, it was simply final. You do not get to sit here and explain my life to me. You don't get to tell me what was good for me, while the man who was good for me is sitting right here and we are both 40 years old. A beat. You stole 22 years from me, from us. And you funded a hospital board that has been committing federal fraud. And you structured the silence of a physician who tried to stop it. That is what you did with your decisions. The silence at the table was enormous. Richard Bennett looked at Nathan, a long measuring look, not hostile, not apologetic, but the look of a man doing a final assessment of a variable he'd spent 22 years trying to eliminate. You're not going to stop this, Richard said, not to Claire, to Nathan. No, Nathan said. The complaint is already filed. Yes. Richard Bennett looked at his daughter again, and for a moment, just a moment, something shifted in his face that was not calculation or control, something older and more genuine and much more painful. I thought I was protecting you, he said, and in that sentence, for the first time, Nathan heard the actual man behind the architecture, not the Richard Bennett who managed variables and arranged outcomes, but the father who had told himself a story for 22 years. And, finally, in this room, could not make the story hold. I know, Claire said. Her voice had changed to still clear, still steady, but something gentler at the edges. Not forgiveness, not yet. Something that acknowledged that the man across from her was not simply a villain, but something more complicated and therefore more painful. But you were wrong. They left 40 minutes later. The lunch had not been eaten. The conversation had been thorough and terrible in the specific way that long overdue conversations are terrible, not dramatic, mostly, but excavating. Richard Bennett had not admitted everything. He had not absolved himself. But he had, by the end, stopped arguing, and that was its own kind of shift. On the sidewalk outside, Claire stood for a moment, and Nathan stood beside her, and neither of them spoke. The city went around them. The ordinary, unknowing city. He's going to cooperate with the investigation, she said finally. What makes you think so? Because I told him that cooperation is the only version of this where he has any control over the outcome. She paused. And because she stopped. Because I think some part of him is relieved. That it's over. That he doesn't have to manage it anymore. Nathan thought about that. Do you believe him? That he thought he was protecting you. She was quiet for a long moment. I believe he believed it, she said carefully. I'm not sure that's the same thing. She turned to look at him. How are you feeling? He considered the question honestly. He was standing on a sidewalk with a woman he'd first loved at 18, 2 months after a building almost killed him. The day after filing a federal complaint that was going to remake the next several years of both their lives. He had fractured ribs that still occasionally reminded him they existed. He had a project director he was going to have to face professional consequences with for the Meridian collapse. He had an enormous amount of uncertain road ahead. Lighter, he said. Strangely lighter. She nodded slowly. Yeah, she said. Me too. He drove her home. She didn't invite him in. They were still in the careful middle space of two people who had rebuilt trust without yet rebuilding everything trust is the foundation for. But when he pulled up in front of her building, She didn't immediately get out. She sat for a moment with the particular stillness of someone with more to say. Nathan. Yeah. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Always. If none of this had happened, she stopped, restarted. If the building hadn't collapsed, if you hadn't ended up in that trauma bay, if I hadn't been the one on shift, she looked at him. Do you think we would have found our way back to each other? He thought about it, genuinely, without rushing to the answer she might want to hear. No, he said, probably not. She nodded slowly. Me neither. But it happened, he said, and here we are. She looked at him for a long moment, and the look she gave him was the most unguarded thing he'd seen from her, yet no professional register, no careful measurement, no composure held in place as armor, just Claire. The Claire who had sat beside him for a year and understood things intuitively that other people had to be taught. Here we are, she said softly. She got out of the car, walked to her door, turned once, briefly, to look at him, not a wave, not a formal goodbye, just a look, and then went inside. Nathan sat at the curb for a moment. Then he drove home. 3 weeks later, Marcus Hale received formal notification from the United States Department of Justice that the federal government had elected to intervene in a False Claims Act complaint filed against Seattle Mercy Health System. The same afternoon, the Washington State Attorney General's office issued a notice of investigation to the Board of Directors regarding conflict of interest disclosure violations. By the following Monday, Hale had hired a defense attorney and issued a statement through the hospital's communications office calling the complaint without and promising full transparency and cooperation. 3 board members issued similar statements. The 2 members with direct investment positions in the private equity fund quietly resigned without issuing any statement at all. On Tuesday, Claire received a letter from Seattle Mercy's chief legal counsel informing her that her clinical privileges were under administrative review pending the outcome of the federal investigation. She called Nathan from the hospital parking lot. They suspended my privileges, she said. I knew they would. It's still, she stopped. I know, he said. 12 years. Her voice was very quiet. I built that department with, she stopped again. I don't regret it. Nathan, 12 years. I know, he said. And then, Claire, can I come over? A pause, she said. Please. He was there in 20 minutes. She answered the door, still in her work clothes, dark slacks, the fitted jacket she wore on administrative days, her hair still up. She looked exhausted in the way of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just now been required to set it down. And the setting down is its own particular kind of hard. He walked in. She sat down on the couch and he sat beside her, and neither of them said anything for a while. The television was off. The apartment was quiet. What do I do tomorrow? She asked, not rhetorically, practically. Tomorrow you call Pat and confirm that the administrative suspension has been formally logged. So it's part of the retaliation record. Then you call the physician advocacy organization. Pat mentioned Dr. Ewan is already working with them. And then you. He paused. And then you do whatever you need to do. Take a walk. Call Diane, she'll make you food whether you want it or not, which I've found has its uses. Come over. Don't come over. Whatever you need. She looked at him, the exhausted, unguarded look of someone who has fought as hard as they're able to fight for one day. I don't know what I need, she said honestly. That's okay, he said. You don't have to know tonight. She leaned back against the cushions. He stayed where he was, close enough to be present, far enough to give her the space of it. The quiet of 2 people at the end of a long, hard thing. Sitting in the knowledge that the hard thing isn't over, but the worst-known moment of it has passed. Nathan, she said, after a while. Yeah. Thank you. She said it plainly, without inflation, in the way of something genuinely meant. For all of it. From the beginning. He was quiet for a moment. You don't have to thank me for that. I want to. Okay, he looked at her. Then you're welcome. She closed her eyes. He stayed. Outside. Seattle continued doing what cities do, indifferent and constant and full of ordinary people, living ordinary lives that contain, invisibly, every kind of weight, the kind carried alone and the kind divided between two people who chose, after a very long time and at considerable cost, to stop carrying theirs separately. The federal investigation was just beginning. The road ahead was long and uncertain, and full of legal processes that did not care about fatigue or timing, or the personal cost to the people at the center. But that night, in a quiet apartment in Seattle, for the first time in 22 years, Nathan Carter and Claire Bennett were in the same room, with all of the truth between them. No one was hiding it, and no one was managing it away. And that was enough for tonight. Tomorrow would carry its own weight. Tonight, this was enough. The federal investigation moved the way federal investigations move, not fast, not dramatic. Nothing like the television version, where evidence gets presented in a single decisive hearing, and someone slams a gavel and justice arrives clean and immediate. It moved through paperwork and depositions and document requests and legal motions and counter-motions. And it consumed months, the way a long construction project consumes budget steadily, relentlessly, with occasional surges of visible progress surrounded by long stretches that looked, from the outside, like nothing was happening at all. Nathan had spent his career on long projects. He understood the discipline of trusting a process that didn't show results on a daily timeline. Claire did not find it as easy. She called him in the second month, on a Thursday night. Her voice carrying the particular strain of someone who has been patient for longer than patience feels sustainable. Pat says the government needs 60 days for document review, she said. They said that 60 days ago. I know. I've been going to the library, she said. And the way she said, it told him everything about what the suspension was costing her. Not the income she'd managed that, the purpose. The daily structure of a life built around being needed. I've been reading, catching up on journals. I taught a guest lecture at the University of Washington last week for a colleague. A pause. I am not someone who was built to wait, Nathan. No, he said. You weren't. Tell me it's worth it. He didn't answer immediately, which was, he'd learned, exactly the right response. She didn't want reassurance that cost nothing. She wanted honesty that cost something. It's worth it, he said. And I know that doesn't make the waiting easier. She exhaled. No, it doesn't. A pause. How's the Meridian situation? He'd been navigating his own professional consequences. The investigation into the Meridian collapse had cleared him of negligence. His safety report having established clearly that he'd identified and flagged the risk before it became a failure. But the corporate client had terminated his contract, and two other firms in the same network had quietly declined to engage him for projects that had previously been on the table. The engineering community was smaller than it looked. People watched how disputes resolved. I picked up a municipal contract, he said. Smaller scale, honest work. Are you okay with that? He thought about it honestly. Yeah, he said. I actually am. She was quiet for a moment. You turned down Callaway Group. He'd been hoping she wouldn't bring that up. Diane had told him she'd mentioned it. His sister had apparently decided that Claire needed to know. Diane talks too much. Callaway offered you the large private structural contract in the Pacific Northwest this year. Diane said you turned it down in a 15-minute phone call. It wasn't the right fit. Nathan. Her voice held the quality it had when she wasn't going to let him redirect. Callaway is connected to the private equity fund. One of the board members who resigned from Seattle Mercity sits on Callaway's advisory committee. I know. So they offered you the contract too. To make this easier to walk away from. Yes, he kept his voice even. Or to create an appearance of compromise that could complicate the investigation. Or both. He paused. It wasn't a difficult decision. Silence. The particular kind she produced when she was feeling something she hadn't decided how to say yet. Nathan, she said finally. Yeah. I need you to know something. She said it carefully. In the way of someone choosing words with real intention, what you've given up the contract, the corporate work. The she stopped. It's not lost on me. I need you to know that. Claire. Let me finish. A breath. You walked back into a collapsing building. For two men you barely knew, you turned down a multi-million-dollar contract because the people offering it were connected to something wrong. You spent six weeks on a busted shoulders, reading public financial filings because I was standing in the middle of something dangerous, and you weren't going to stand outside and wait. A pause. I don't know what I did to deserve that, but I'm not going to pretend I don't see it. He was quiet for a long moment. You sat next to me for a year in chemistry class, he said finally. And you made me feel like the way my mind worked was something worth having. I was 17. I didn't know how rare that was. He paused. So let's call it even. She laughed, short and real. The fully unguarded kind that still hit him the same way it had in the hospital. That's the most engineering-brained romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. I'll work on my delivery. Don't, she said. I mean it, don't. They stayed on the phone for another hour, talking about everything and nothing. The guest lecture she'd given, a documentary he'd watched, the slow, awkward process of Diane learning to text, and the deeply chaotic results of that development. The ordinary texture of two people who have woven themselves into each other's daily life so gradually that neither of them has identified the exact moment it became indispensable. He didn't say that, but he thought it. The break in the investigation came on a Tuesday morning in the 4th month, and it came not from the federal processes, but from an unexpected direction. Dr. Ewan, quiet, methodical Dr. Ewan, who had hugged Claire goodbye and said, "Take care of yourself," whatever that requires, had kept his own records. 2 years of them, more detailed than Claire's, covering an earlier period, documenting not just staffing discrepancies, but a specific sequence of administrative directives that had been issued verbally, never in writing, instructing department heads to approve resource requests only below a specific cost threshold, regardless of clinical need. He delivered them through Pat Gorman on a Tuesday morning, in a binder that Pat described on the phone to Nathan as the kind of thing that makes federal investigators visibly pleased. He kept 2 years of records. Nathan told Claire that evening he was waiting. For what? For someone else to file first. So he wasn't alone. The silence on her end of the phone was long and felt like something being understood at a level deeper than the words. He was waiting for me, she said quietly. He was waiting for someone. You were the one who moved. Another silence. How many people, she said slowly, are sitting on something they know is wrong, waiting for someone else to go first? More than we'd like, Nathan said. Fewer than we fear. Ewan's records broke the logjam. The government's document review accelerated. Pat called in the 5th month to say that 3 additional former employees had come forward voluntarily, not physicians, but administrative staff, 2 nurses and a billing coordinator, whose conscience had apparently been louder than her NDA, the latter of which Pat indicated was likely unenforceable given the circumstances. By the 6th month, Marcus Hale's legal team had stopped filing counter-motions and started filing requests for settlement conferences. He's going to settle, Pat told them in a conference call. The government prefers it faster resolution, guaranteed recovery. Hale gets to avoid a public trial. The board members, with the conflict of interest exposure, have already indicated willingness to cooperate in exchange for consideration. A pause. Richard Bennett's firm is being asked to provide documentation voluntarily. Your father's attorney has been in contact with my office. Claire. Is he cooperating? A pause. His attorney says he is prepared to be fully forthcoming. Claire said nothing for a moment then. Good. The settlement was announced publicly in the 7th month. The Department of Justice issued a press release using the words systematic fraud, patient safety violations, and significant recovery for federal healthcare programs. The specific dollar figure was $12.4 million. Hale resigned. The board was reconstituted under state oversight. 3 executives except administrative things. The 2 board members with undisclosed investment positions paid civil penalties and were barred from serving on nonprofit boards for 7 years. The hospital, under emergency interim leadership appointed by the state, began the process of restoring staffing to required levels. Claire's clinical privileges were reinstated 8 days after the settlement announcement. She called Nathan from the parking lot again, but this time her voice had a different quality, entirely not the strained patience of the waiting months, not the careful evenness she used when something was hard, something lighter, something that had weight but not the pressing, compressive kind. "They gave me my badge back," she said. He could hear what those 5 words contained. "How does it feel?" "Like putting on a coat you thought you'd lost," she said. Exactly like that. She went back to the emergency department the following Monday. Her charge nurse Maria met her at the door, took one look at her, and hugged her without saying anything first. 3 residents, who'd been assigned to other departments during her suspension, materialized by mid-morning and found reasons to be nearby. Dr. Ewan, who had quietly taken a position at a smaller community hospital during his own absence from Seattle Mercy, sent flowers and a card that said simply, "I told you to take care of yourself. You took care of all of us. Why?" She told Nathan about the card that evening, and her voice did the thing it did when she was not going to cry, but was also not entirely not crying. "You should call him," Nathan said. "I already did." A pause. He said he's been offered the department chief position at his current hospital. He's going to take it. Another pause. He said, "Dr. Bennett, some buildings need to come down so the right ones can go up." He sounded like someone else I know. "I'll take that as a compliment." It was one, she said. The months that followed were quieter than any of the preceding months had been, and the quiet had a different texture than any of the quiet that had come before that. Not the silence of things unsaid, not the silence of weight being managed. The quiet of 2 people who have been through something significant together and are now, carefully and with full awareness of what it costs to do this honestly, building something new on ground that is finally, actually clear. They had dinner, real dinner, planned, neither of them pretending it was casual. He cooked badly. He would acknowledge freely, though with genuine effort. She contributed wine and the diplomatic graciousness to eat the overcooked salmon without comment. They talked for 4 hours about their 20s, which they'd spent apart, about mistakes hers, the ones that were fair to call mistakes and the ones that had just been circumstances, about what they wanted, going forward, in terms they hadn't used with each other yet, because the space for that conversation hadn't existed until now. "I'm not interested in going slowly because I'm uncertain," she said, somewhere in the 3rd hour, with the directness that he had come to recognize as her truest register. "I'm interested in going carefully because I'm certain and I don't want to damage it." He looked at her. "There's a difference." "Yes," she said, "there is." He understood the difference. He'd spent his career on that difference, the distinctions between caution born from doubt and caution born understood from respect for something. You understood well enough to know it deserved to be handled with precision. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she agreed. 3 months after her reinstatement, Claire was offered a position, not at Seattle Mercy, which was still in the slow, complicated process of rebuilding its culture under new leadership. Something different. A consortium of community health organizations, backed by a philanthropic foundation and a federal community health grant, was establishing a new nonprofit trauma center on the south side of Seattle, designed specifically to provide emergency care regardless of income or insurance status. The model was built on the research Claire had published 3 years earlier in that journal article Nathan had read twice the night he came home from the hospital. Her research, her framework, someone had read it and built a funding model around it. and was now offering her the position of medical director. She called him at 6 in the morning. He was already awake. He'd been awake since 5 because he was working on a proposal, and he was the kind of person who started working before the city did. "They're offering me the directorship," she said, without preamble. He put down his pen. "Tell me." She told him all of it, the scope, the funding, the patient population it would serve, the clinical model, the staffing philosophy. He listened without interrupting, the way she listened to him, completely and without filling the spaces. By the time she finished, the quality of her voice had already answered the question he was going to ask. "You already know what you want to do," he said. "Yes, no hesitation. I've known since the 3rd sentence." "Then take it." "Nathan." "Claire." He kept his voice steady and warm. "You've been building toward this for 20 years, without knowing it. Your research, your documentation, the fight you just survived it was all pointing here." He paused. "Take it." A silence, the best kind. The kind that means yes is already decided and the silence is just the space of feeling it. "I'm taking it," she said. She accepted the position on a Wednesday. She gave Seattle Mercy 30 days' notice, which they accepted with the particular institutional patient and graciousness of an organization that owed her considerably more than 30 days of courtesy. She spent those 30 days in the emergency department doing what she had always done, treating patients with the complete, focused attention that Maria, the charge nurse, had once said made people feel like the only person in the building and also beginning the work of preparing to build something from the ground floor. Nathan, meanwhile, had been doing something he hadn't told her about yet, not because he was hiding it, but because he'd wanted to be certain it was real before he said it out loud. He'd been in conversations with the same community health consortium, not about a clinical position, about the building, the physical structure of the new trauma center. He'd been approached 3 weeks after Claire's directorship offer by the project architect, who had been given Nathan's name by a city planning official, who knew his work on municipal infrastructure. The project needed a structural engineer who understood how to build high-capacity emergency facilities on restricted urban sites with limited budgets, who had experience negotiating between clinical requirements and construction constraints, and who had a track record of prioritizing function and safety over aesthetic. The project architect had presented the brief. Nathan had asked 2 questions, looked at the site plans for 40 minutes, and said yes. He told Claire on the same Thursday that he signed the agreement. She was quiet for so long that he started to think the call had dropped. "Nathan," she said finally. "Yeah. You're going to build my hospital." "Our hospital," he said. "Technically the consortium's, but yes." Another silence. Longer. He heard her breath, the particular breath of someone who is feeling something large and is taking a moment to locate the right words for it. "I don't know what to say," she said. And from Claire Bennett, who always knew what to say. That was the most genuine thing she could have offered. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "Yes, I do." A pause. "I love you, Nathan." He had been expecting many things from this conversation. He had not been expecting that, on a Thursday afternoon, in those exact words, in that exact tone, simple and direct and completely without performance, the way she did everything that mattered. He sat with it for exactly the right amount of time, not too fast, not making her wait. "I love you too, Claire," he said. "I've been working back toward that for about 7 months. It's good to get there." She laughed, the full, real laugh that he had been collecting since she first produced it in the hospital and had not stopped wanting to hear. They didn't make it dramatic after that. They didn't need to. The dramatic part was already done. What followed was the ordinary, irreplaceable work of 2 people who love each other, deciding what that looks like in practical terms, day by day, with the same care and precision they brought to everything else that mattered. The new trauma center broke ground on a morning in early spring. Nathan was on site at 7, walking the foundation layout with the project architect, when he felt the familiar solidity of being on ground that was about to become the Gopin Sultan, the particular feeling of standing at the beginning of a structure that would, if the work was done right, outlast everyone involved in building it. Claire arrived at 8. She wasn't supposed to be there. She had administrative meetings, consortium calls, the endless logistical work of standing up a new institution. But she showed up in her work coat with 2 coffees and stood beside him at the edge of the site and looked at the cleared ground. "It's just dirt right now," she said. "All buildings start as dirt," he said. "Then someone decides what it should become." She looked at him, the warm, direct, unguarded look that she'd stopped rationing sometime around month 6. "You say structural things and I hear personal things. I'm not sure if that's you or me. Probably both." She handed him one of the coffees. They stood at the edge of the site together, and he thought about the morning the Meridian Tower fell, and the pain, and the hospital, and a voice he hadn't heard in 22 years, leaning close and asking if he remembered. He pointed lighters in a mailbox, and letters that never arrived, and a summer in Connecticut, and 2 kids who had loved each other without knowing enough yet about what love requires to protect it. He thought about Pat Gorman's office, and a Sunday lunch, and a precise, controlled man across a restaurant table, who had finally, in the end, run out of things to manage. He thought about the quiet of a Tuesday evening in Claire's apartment, and the way some things, when they are finally true, don't announce themselves, they just settle, solid and weight-bearing, into the place where they were always supposed to be. 1 year after the trauma center broke ground, it opened. It was a Saturday in October, and the sky over Seattle was doing what Seattle skies do: a fine, persistent mist that technically wasn't rain, but got you wet anyway, which most Seattle residents had long since stopped distinguishing from actual rain. The opening event was modest by design, Claire's design. No ribbon, no press fanfare, beyond the local health beat reporters who covered community medicine. A gathering of the people who had made it happen, and the people who would be served by it. Maria, the charge nurse, was there, having followed Claire to the new institution as department supervisor. Dr. Yuan had driven up from his hospital an hour south and stood in the back with his hands in his coat pockets and a look on his face that Nathan recognized from job site completions, the look of someone seeing a finished thing that they helped make possible, quietly accounting for what it cost. Diane was there, with food she had made and brought uninvited, which was simply how Diane operated. Pat Gorman stood near the entrance, talking to the consortium director, and the 2 of them had the satisfied look of men who had shepherded something difficult to a good outcome. Reyes and Dominguez were there. Nathan hadn't planned that. He hadn't reached out to them about the event, but they showed up, Reyes, with all 3 kids, the oldest of whom was 11, and regarded the new building with the evaluating gravity of a child who understood instinctively that this place existed partly because of his father. Dominguez, with his wife, and a 1-year-old who occupied his arms with complete authority. When Dominguez saw Nathan across the room, he crossed to him without hesitation and embraced him in the full, unguarded way of a man from a culture that has not confused formality with respect. "You built this," Dominguez said, looking around the space. "I built the structure," Nathan said. "The reason it exists is more complicated." Dominguez looked across the room to where Claire was talking to a group of nurses, one hand moving as she explained something. Her whole body engaged the way it always was when she was talking about something she cared about. Then he looked back at Nathan. "It's not that complicated," he said, and smiled. Near sunset, Nathan found Claire at the window of her office, the medical director's office, which she had furnished with characteristic efficiency and almost no personal decoration except for a framed print of a structural diagram he'd sent her as a joke 3 months ago, that she'd apparently liked enough to frame and hang, which he still wasn't sure how to feel about. "It's real," she said. Not to him specifically, to the fact of it. "Did you think it wouldn't be?" I thought about all the ways it could have not been, she said. The investigation stalling, the funding falling through, the state refusing the licensing. You and I, she stopped. You and I what? She looked at him. Not finding our way back. He held her gaze. We found it. We did, she said barely, and at considerable cost. The costly ones are the ones that hold, he said. She studied him for a moment. Is that structural engineering or life advice? By this point, he said. I'm not sure I can tell the difference. She almost smiled. Then she reached past him and picked up a box that had been sitting on the corner of her desk, a weathered wooden box, the kind that might have held documents or photographs or letters, old enough that the wood had darkened at the edges and the brass latch had gone dull. He recognized it. She'd mentioned it once, months ago, a box she'd found in her parents' storage. When she was gathering documentation for the investigation, her father had given it to her quietly, without explanation. When the cooperation with investigators had begun, she hadn't told Nathan what was in it. He hadn't asked. She set it on the desk between them and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. I've been waiting for the right moment, she said. Is this it? I think so. She opened the latch, inside, folded and yellowed at the edges with the particular fragility of paper that has been kept a long time in a place where temperature and light were not carefully managed, were letters. He could see without counting that there were many. 24, perhaps more. He recognized his own handwriting on the top envelope, the looping, slightly uneven print of a 22-year-old who had not yet developed the precise technical lettering of an engineer. The address was Claire's family home in the East Lake neighborhood, and across the front, in a different hand, Gerald Marsh's. He assumed a single word, hold. He looked at Claire. All of them, she said quietly. His and mine both. Gerald Marsh kept them. My father didn't destroy them. I don't know if that means something, or if it's just I don't know what it means. Nathan thought about a precise, controlled man who had taken 22 years of letters and not destroyed them, who had kept them in a box, who had handed that box to his daughter when the weight of what he'd done had finally become heavier than his reasons for doing it. I think, Nathan said carefully, it means he knew, even then, that he was wrong. And he couldn't make himself destroy the evidence of it. Claire looked at the box. Maybe, she said. Or maybe he just couldn't let go of the control of it, even stored away. Maybe both. She nodded slowly. Maybe both. She lifted the first letter from the stack, one of hers, her handwriting younger and rounder and less contained than it was now. And she looked at it and then looked at him and said, Do you want to read them? He thought about it. About what was in those letters the summer after graduation. Two 18-year-olds writing to each other with the particular honesty that people produce when they believe they're being heard. The things he'd written that he hadn't had the courage to say in person. The things she'd written that had sat in a box for 22 years waiting for the wrong set of hands to release them.
Yes, he said.
But not alone. She sat down. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. The easy, unperformed proximity of two people who have stopped managing the distance between them. She handed him the first letter, one of his, and he first letter Harriet, and he looked at his own 22-year-old handwriting and felt the specific tenderness and grief of meeting a younger version of yourself across time. They read. Not fast, not performing the reading for each other, genuinely reading. The way you read things that were written with care, the letters from his stack and the letters from hers, in rough chronological order, the whole sequence of a conversation that had been interrupted for 2 decades and was completing itself now in a room that Claire had built and Nathan had structured, on ground they had earned together at real cost. Some of the letters were small news, observations. The things two young people fill letters with when they're still learning what they want to say. Some of them were not small at all. Some of them said, in the direct and unguarded language of 18-year-olds, who hadn't yet learned to protect themselves with careful phrasing. Exactly what he had felt, and exactly what she had felt, in words that neither of them had ever gotten to hear the other say. At some point, he reached for her hand. She let him take it. She didn't look up from the letter she was reading, but her hand closed around his with the quiet certainty of something that has found the place it was looking for. They stayed there until the light outside went fully dark, and the sound of the last guests departing had faded, and the building settled into the particular quiet of an institution at the end of its first day, full of the weight of what it was for, and the first faint residue of lives it had already begun to carry. Nathan set down the last letter. Claire set down hers. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she looked at him, the full, clear, open look that had no armor in it, and no distance and no careful measurement. Just Claire. Just this. "So," she said softly, "do you remember everything now?" He looked at her. At the girl from second period chemistry, who had understood load-bearing equations intuitively and noticed the diagrams in the margins of his notes and made him feel, at 17, like the way his mind worked was something worth having. At the woman who had kept 8 months of staffing logs and faced a hospital board and walked into a Sunday lunch with her father and whispered his name in a trauma bay and loved him across 22 years of silence without knowing she was doing it. He thought about everything it had cost to get here. Every fracture, literal and otherwise. Every document and phone call, and hard conversation, and quiet evening that had built, one weight-bearing element at a time, into the structure of the thing they now had. "I never forgot you," he said. "I just never knew the whole story." She smiled. And it was the realest thing in the room, more solid than the walls he'd engineered, more weight-bearing than anything he'd ever designed, more lasting than any structure he would ever build. She leaned in, and he met her there, and outside the city went on being the city, indifferent and constant, and full of people living lives that contain, invisibly, every kind of love, the kind that gets interrupted and the kind that holds, and the kind that finds its way back through 22 years of wrong turns and other people's choices. And finally, at real cost and with full honesty, arrives at the place it was always meant to be. Some things don't break when they're tested. They just wait, patient and structural. For the moment, someone removes what was holding them apart, and then they hold.